Welcome to the Democracy's College podcast series. This podcast focuses on educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students in P20 educational pathways. This podcast is a product of the Office of Community College Research and Leadership, or OCCRL, at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Learn more about OCCRL at occrl.illinois.edu. In this episode, Dr. Eboni Zamani-Gallaher from OCCRL will talk with Dr. Dafina-Lazarus Stewart, a professor of higher education and student affairs at Bowling Green State University, about racial equity and justice in educational settings.
Dr. Stewart recently visited the University of Illinois and spoke on Minding the Gap, covering the distance between diversity and institutional transformation. We're so excited to speak about the topic of racial equity and justice in educational settings with you. First off, we'd like to ask about some things in terms of ongoing aggressions. In the face of ongoing aggressions, micro and macro, against racialized minorities on university college campuses, what do you find is the role of faculty, staff, and student activists in response to racial inequities?
I think they play critical roles in bringing awareness to what the issues are that are of particular concern and that are hindering progress toward greater racial equity and justice in our colleges and universities. And I think that's probably the first critical role they play. I think secondly, beyond awareness, they're also contributing to putting the pressure on and provoking attention and actual change to take place, so that it's not just a matter of bringing awareness, but continuing to apply pressure. I think the third role that faculty, staff, and student activism can play in response to racial inequities on campus is actually being able to provide a vision of how things could be different. So what could that change look like? What must it look like? And to play a role at the table as those decisions are made that will actually lead to greater institutional transformation.
Thank you. That's quite interesting. In your conversations with people in your talk yesterday for the College of Education Dean's Diversity Lecture Series, as you think about what's going on in society, particularly post-2016 election, how do you see that playing out on college campuses? And in particular, if you could speak to the P20 educational settings in terms of how distinct some of the concerns are related to minoritized populations.
I think one of the things that has been apparent is what I mentioned in my talk. It's about twice the generations. When you think about every decade, there are calls that come forward from faculty, staff, and students from racially minoritized groups to make demands at their institutions over and over again. Requests for more faculty and staff of color and students of color, the need for faculty and staff of color to successfully advance through tenure and promotion, and to advance into senior level administrative roles, the need for greater financial resources to support students of color to enroll and to stay at the institution, training for racially majoritized faculty on how to deal effectively and appropriately with issues of equity and inclusion in the classroom, hostile campus climates and incidents of microaggressions, campus counseling center staff who are actually competent in addressing racial battle fatigue and racial trauma. All of these issues, and of course the multiple identities of students of color and dealing with the intersecting oppressions they face on campus in terms of sexuality and gender, social class, disability as well. So in those ways, within the higher education context, those issues take on particular nuance and concern because of the very different ways and the wide variety and diversity of ways that students and people become involved in higher education. So different from, let's say, the P through 12 sector, our primary and secondary sectors where there is mandatory education, so students have to go to school. And so in some ways, schools have to find ways to deal with equitably with students in the classroom, or at least they recognize that they're going to have difference in diversity in the classroom. That's not necessarily a presumed situation at all colleges and universities. So we move to the post-secondary level, it shifts, and institutions have much more, we could say, autonomy and choice in how they shape their classes, incoming classes, how they shape the faculty and staff that are working with those students. And that greater degree of autonomy in post-secondary education, I think, adds an additional layer of nuance and complexity to how these issues show up and how they are dealt with at that level.
Thank you, Dr. Stewart. One of the things that you also mentioned in your talk yesterday was contrasting the language, if you will, and in terms of what we know to be ways in which diversity and inclusion, social justice, that these terms are conflated. Could you talk to us a little bit more about kind of the variation or the contrast, if you will, between what diversity looks like and what equity is, what social justice is, and what inclusion entails?
Absolutely. To cover the gap between compositional diversity, who's in the room, and institutional transformation, we need to do more than just center diversity and inclusion and really move forward to amplify efforts to promote equity and justice. Diversity and inclusion are not terms that are actually related inherently to equity and justice. So one of the issues with that is that we see higher ed institutions often taking what I called a Kool-Aid approach to addressing the deep systemic and structural issues that have resulted in racial injustice and inequity in our colleges and universities. So for too long, we've centered the goal of achieving a critical mass of racially minoritized constituents as the best reflection of a campus progress, where white, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, temporarily able-bodied, and middle and upper class people are the water, and minoritized people are the cherry Kool-Aid mix, as it were. We merely have poured the contents of this cherry-flavored pouch into the existing water and stirred and hoped that it would be enough to produce sustainable change. And that's clearly not been effective and have not been the case. And so I argue that it's time for colleges and universities to stop trying to make Kool-Aid for the picnic already in progress, that we really need to pay attention to how to move beyond merely counting who's in the room to actually examine how our institutional norms, practices, and systems continue to reproduce conditions that frustrate efforts to achieve equity and diversity. So, for instance, we think about the different ways that these concepts approach the issues is important. So, diversity asks, for instance, who's in the room? Equity approach asks, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice, though, asks, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority? Diversity asks, well, how many more of X group do we have this year than last year? Equity responds, well, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups as the perpetual majority here? Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice answers, well, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable in maintaining their dehumanizing views? A diversity approach asks, well, is it separatist to provide funding for an ethnic student center? An equity approach asks, what are people experiencing on campus that they don't feel safe when isolated and separated from others like themselves? Inclusion focuses on, well, wouldn't it be great to have a program that would debate with a panel that debates Black Lives Matter as a movement? A justice approach says, well, why would we allow the humanity and dignity of a group of people to be the subject of a debate in the first place? So in these ways, diversity celebrates increases in numbers that still reflect minoritized positions and incremental growth, whereas equity celebrates reductions in harm, revisions to abusive systems, and increases and supports for people's lives and life chances as reported by those who have been targeted. Inclusion celebrates awards for initiatives and credits itself for having an ethnically diverse candidate pool, but a justice approach celebrates getting rid of practices and policies that were having disparate impacts on minoritized groups in the first place. So that to me is the difference. Diversity and inclusion were never meant to produce equity and justice. Those concepts and constructs really represent merely evolutionary changes that do little to actually change the essence of an organization and how it operates, whereas equity and justice represent revolutionary change that's designed to dismantle in order to rebuild. And so I believe that if our colleges and universities are going to make a difference in issues of equity and justice, we need to embrace revolution, not merely evolution.
Thanks, Dr. Stewart. As you mentioned, what universities and colleges can do, and we know that they've publicly made commitments to improving racial justice on campus, but what tangible corrective actions can leaders take to initiate the work that you just discussed in the way of the nuances of moving beyond just the compositional diversity to cultivating learning environments that actively counter the marginalization of racialized minorities and other minoritized groups?
Sure. For instance, it's not enough to recruit more racially minoritized faculty, right? One also needs to be examining reappointment, tenure, and promotion systems and hostile and toxic department cultures that create a revolving door. And in that revolving door, when racially minoritized faculty are constantly moving in and out every 3 to 4 years, it destabilizes community building efforts and isolates tokenized faculty that manage to make it through. So it's not just the recruitment, it's really examining the systems and structures that support retention. It's not enough to do annual training on using inclusive language in the classroom, for instance, if we never really take to heart efforts to call out and disrupt faculty assumptions of the presumed incompetence of the racially minoritized students in their classroom. The faculty are still assigning readings that reinforce normative assumptions that bolster whiteness and white supremacy. The faculty are not taught to recognize and disrupt the creation of study and project groups that are often students are allowed to do on their own, but they tend to do so in ways that often ostracize, marginalize, and exclude racially minoritized students. We also have to think about how we can hold faculty accountable as part of the departments and colleges' advancement systems for how they're actively contributing or failing to contribute to creating just and sustainable classroom environments. So it's moving beyond just merely, bringing people in the door. And again, what are the things that are underneath that, and really thinking about systemic and structural change. Many times institutions boast about receiving an award for a diversity initiative that somehow did something to celebrate diversity or got students involved in celebrating difference and what that means, but they're often absent any concrete assessment of the sustained impact of those initiatives. So those things need to be happening as well. We can't just recruit students if we're not actually examining and making structural changes to disrupt and revolutionize the classroom climates, the residence hall environments that often are hostile and toxic to these minoritized groups. Those are the kinds of things that I think are tangible, actionable corrective actions that leadership can take on campuses.
Thank you. As we close, is there an additional call to action you would like to issue to those listening today if they want to take a more active role in advocating for racial justice?
Absolutely. I would encourage people to first do the self-work, the interior work necessary to learn about and then unlearn the internalized dominance or internalized oppression that all of us have been socialized into in this country. That kind of self-work is essential to actually being effective positively effective in impacting affecting change in our campuses. I will also encourage folks to actively seek to build coalitions with others who are also members of minoritized populations on campus. We will gain more by working together than by working separately, to recognizing that our futures are really bound up together with each other. We don't need to compete. We can actually work collaboratively in coalition to achieve gains that will improve the life chances and the educational experiences of everybody on campus, not just one group at a time.
Thank you. We are very happy to have brought with you a conversation with Dr. Dafina-Lazarus Stewart.
For more information about racial equity and justice in educational settings, we recommend that you visit Dr. Dafina-Lazarus Stewart's website at Bowling Green State University for a list of publications and additional reading. For more podcasts, links to today's recommended resources, or to share your comments and suggestions, visit occrl.illinois.edu/democracy or send them via Twitter at OCCRL. Tune in next month when Dr. Eboni Zamani-Gallaher from OCCRL will talk with Dr. Deanne Squire from Iowa State University for our second podcast on racial equity and justice in educational settings. Background music for this podcast is provided by DubLab. Thank you for listening and your contribution towards educational equity, justice, and excellence for all students.